Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you a video talking about my favorite cozy or comfort horror reads, which might sound like a bit of a contradiction. I define a comfort read as a book that I pick up when I'm feeling stressed, maybe something's going on in my personal life or at work, or maybe world events are just getting to me at the moment, and I just need something that's going to distract me. At those moments, I'll be honest, I'm not always drawn towards a really scary horror book or a really terrifying thriller. In general, I actually tend to pick up a lot of cute contemporary. That's times that I will read YA or reread some of my favorites, and the kind of books that I don't actually talk about a lot on my channel, like The Fault in Our Stars and Fangirl and all of that. But sometimes I do pick up horror books, but I pick up a certain kind, and I describe them as my cozy horror books. And so don't get me wrong, they're definitely horror, they do fit into the genre, but for one reason or another, I just find them to be very comforting. And so I want to recommend these books to you for, again, those times that you want to read horror, but you're just feeling a little bit anxious and you need a book to help self-soothe. So hopefully you'll find something good. These are all books that I've really enjoyed and do recommend, whether you're in a stressed mood or not, so hopefully you find some good recommendations here. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's start with The Ghost Tree by Christina Henry, and this story takes place in a small town where we are following the story from a few different perspectives, one being the police that are investigating these brutal murders. They find these young girls with their heads cut off and they have to investigate what is going on. However, a lot of the town just seems to be very ambivalent to these horrible crimes. We also follow the story from the perspective of two young girls that are slowly coming of age. One of them is getting interested in boys and the other one is not so much, and one of them starts to see something supernatural in the woods. They start to see images of these dead girls, and we also get the perspective of the younger brother who has some potential supernatural abilities, and the story goes from there. Now this one I want to recommend as a horror comfort read because it is very, very tropey, as you can probably guess from that synopsis. So what I mean by that is it hits on a lot of the classic tropes of the horror genre. You have the coming of age narrative, which in my opinion is always a really cozy aspect of horror and something that I really enjoy. I've done a previous video on it, so definitely go check that out for more recommendations. But it reaches into other tropes. So it has the supernatural kids, which I really like, with some kind of paranormal abilities. You have the friendships that are breaking down, and it's very relationship focused in this story. And again, to me, it just felt very familiar. The first time I read this book, it almost felt like I was reading a book for the second time because I was very familiar with it. So I always say, this book is not one that is going to reinvent the genre, but when I'm in an anxious mood, I don't need that. I need something that's familiar and a little bit predictable, but that does not mean that I did not enjoy it, because I definitely did. It's one of my favorite books. I've returned to it many times, and I do think that it's perfect for those anxious moods, and it's actually relatively short. So unlike a lot of other stories that kind of follow these paranormal epic narratives, this is actually very self-contained, and despite the fact that it has these grisly murders at the heart of the story, it really doesn't get that dark or gruesome, so definitely one that is safe to pick up when you're in that anxious mood. Next up, we have The Caretaker of Lauren Field by Dave Zeltzerman, and this is a story that takes place in a town where we follow a man who is the caretaker of this field. Every day he goes out to weed the field. The town people pay for his job and are starting to wonder why they are paying him so much to do this work, and so they are deciding whether or not they should just let his position go. However, from his perspective, this job is very important because it has been a long-running tradition in his family where the men go out and weed this field in order to stop the monsters from growing out through the weeds. And this is a story that I really like because it just, again, feels very cozy. And what I mean in this case is the fact that it's this very quaint idea, this little man who goes and weeds the field every day. It's a very simple setup, it's a very simple story, but it's a lot of fun because, it's a horror story, so you have to wonder, is anything actually going on, or is this man crazy? And the story moves along. It's a very short story, it's very readable, and again, kind of hits some of the classic horror tropes, but I just thought it was so smart. I love the little narrative, and I thought that it was just very well done. So again, if you have not read this one, I think it's more of a hidden gem, and I would really love to see more people picking it up. Next, we have The Reaping by Bernard Taylor, and this follows a man who works as an artist. He is commissioned to go to this estate and paint this portrait. He goes there. The staff are very strange, but it seems like a fine enough job. He does the work and leaves. However, after he leaves, he finds out that something terrible happened and has to go from there. I don't want to spoil too much of the plot, but just know that this is a very classic narrative that starts off very slow, and I'll be honest, the first good chunk of the book did not read like horror to me. It just felt like this really cozy book about this artist and his family, and he's going along and he makes this portrait and then he leaves, and you spend a long time just with the characters before the horror elements start. So I found this book to be very comforting because it wasn't very terrifying off the start, but it builds into a really classic tropey horror ending, one that I really enjoy when I see. It's, again, not one that you'll never be able to see coming. I do think it's reasonably predictable if you've read a lot of horror, but I personally really enjoyed it, and once you start to see all the pieces coming together as the characters figure out what is going on, I thought it was a lot of fun. And there's something about the narrative, again, that just feels so comforting. I really like this author and how he writes his stories, because you almost could just picture them as being like a Neil Gaiman cozy story, and it's just very enjoyable. These are easy classics to get into, and personally, of all of his work, The Reaping is my favorite and definitely the coziest. Now, speaking of Neil Gaiman, I also want to give a quick recommendation for Coraline, his middle grade horror. This follows a young girl who is living in a house with her parents. She ends up finding out how to access a portal or a door to the other world, where the parents in this world appear to be like her parents, but not quite. They have buttons sewn over their eyes, and the world is just very strange. They want her to stay, and of course she wants to go back to her real life and real family. And this story for me is the perfect blend of being a very cute, quaint story, because it is middle grade and it is written for that audience, but at the same time it definitely is horror. It has those creepy elements, but again, it's tame enough because, you know, it's for middle grade, so it doesn't have like huge content warnings or terrible subject matter that is just, you know, very disturbing to read. So for me, it kind of walks that line, and I definitely recommend if you can do the audiobook. It's narrated by the author himself, who has this really cozy voice that will just make you want to like wrap up with a blanket around a fireplace. And I just think that this one is, again, a perfect one that I personally go back to when I'm feeling anxious but want to read horror. Middle grade horror is a really good place to go. Next, I actually want to recommend a graphic novel, and that is Afterlife with Archie. And actually, I want to recommend all of the horror Archie graphic novels, and there are a whole bunch of them. You can start pretty much anywhere. Afterlife with Archie is my favorite, but I definitely love several of them. And I want to recommend these because they are definitely horror narratives. So they take the characters from the classic Archie comics and they put them in horror situations. In this one, there is a situation where Jughead's dog dies. Sabrina brings them back to life and possibly starts a zombie outbreak. There's also a story, or rather another graphic novel, that involves Veronica becoming a vampire. There's one where Jughead becomes a werewolf, and I've read all of them. I really enjoy them. And for me, these ones are cozy because I have a long-standing love for the Archie comics. I used to read them religiously growing up. My grandmother used to always collect them at garage sales, and so every time I went to my grandmother's house, we would just obsessively read Archie comics in her basement. Did anyone else do that? Like, I feel like this is like iconic childhood memories, for me at least. And so getting to spend more time with the characters as adults, but getting to bring in those horror elements I love, it's just the perfect blend. And I've said before, and I'm going to say it again, that given the premise of these stories, you can think that they're going to be super campy, and I was like, oh, these are going to be so cheesy. But the authors of the stories do a really good job of actually walking the line, and the tone of these stories remains quite serious. And so I found them to be very entertaining, but also, again, a little bit horrifying, a little bit creepy, and just keeping a serious enough tone that it really kept me engaged. So again, if you're open to graphic novels, these are some of my favorites. If you have a love for the Archies, this is definitely a way to kind of, again, keep your toes in the horror genre when you're feeling anxious, but also reading something that's going to be really comforting, really familiar, and really fun. From there, I want to talk about The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, which, yes, is a very beloved classic. Essentially, we follow a man who is going to investigate a supposedly haunted house. Before he goes in, he gathers a bunch of experts, those with scientific backgrounds and paranormal backgrounds and psychics and so forth, to go and investigate the house with them. They all gather, and then potentially terrible things ensue. I will admit that I don't entirely love this book. I did find it to be a little bit slow paced, and that's mostly because I can be a little bit hit or miss when it comes to horror classics, or classics in general, I should say. However, if you want to talk cozy horror, I could not stop describing this book as cozy and quaint when I was reading it, because while it has this supposedly scary setup, and I know a lot of people do find this book to be really horrifying, I have kind of mixed feelings when it comes to haunted houses, as most of you know. So for me, it wasn't so much scary. Instead, I just thought it was kind of an adorable setup, because you get all of these characters together, and what do they do when they get to the house? They all sit around in the living room, or whatever the parlor room would have been called at the time, and they talk, and there's just the most adorable banter. They all go back and forth, and you get to listen in on their conversations, and it just feels very comforting. I don't know, I've never watched an episode of Downton Abbey, but I do feel like this is what it felt like to watch that show, because it just felt like a bunch of characters sitting around, and it's very of the time and all of that. So I personally think that The Haunting of Hill House is super cozy and super quaint. I mean that with all the respect in the world. So if you have not yet read the book, I do think that it's a nice, really safe one to pick up. Again, I know other people found it super scary, but for me, it was just a very comforting, familiar narrative that again follows the classic tropes of the haunted house genre, largely because it invented or made popular a lot of those classic tropes. So definitely recommend. If you haven't read Shirley Jackson, you definitely should. And finally, I want to end with a 2-for-1 recommendation, and this kind of leans into the fact that I do find that when I'm looking for familiar, comforting horror read, I often go to the horror classics. But I'm going to give you a bit of a spin on not just recommending a classic, but instead recommending books that are mashups or retellings of those classics. So I've had the opportunity to read a couple books by an author named Cindy Wignett, and the first book is Dracula Ascending, and this is a mashup of Dracula, obviously from the title, along with Frankenstein. And in the setup of this book, we follow Frankenstein as he is being put on trial for several crimes, and you find out that he has created a monster. However, in this case, the monster that Frankenstein creates is actually what we know as Dracula. And I thought that this book was really interesting, how it brought the two classics together. And this book, despite how you might think it could be, I was really worried before I picked it up. I thought it might be cheesy or campy, but it wasn't. It has a really serious tone, but I found it to be very comforting because, again, if you're familiar with the narratives of either or both classics, you're going to see those nods and winks. The author clearly loves the classics themselves and really brings that into the story. So you get to see these familiar elements, but they are remixed, remastered, and mashed up into a different story. And so I really liked this one. I thought it was very creative. And speaking again, going back to the book I just recommended, The Haunting of Hill House, if you like that, you'll want to read Fall of the House of Crane, because this is a mashup of The Haunting of Hill House tied in with some Edgar Allan Poe stories. And so this one, very similar, follows a doctor who goes into a house to investigate. He brings in experts, terrible things ensue, and it definitely feels like a retelling of The Haunting of Hill House. So again, if you've already read The Haunting of Hill House, if you're looking for more, if you're looking for something new, I really recommend these mashups. They were very comforting and very fun to get through, well written, and just, again, kind of creative, underhyped, and I do think that they are a lot of fun and a great place to go, again, if you're looking for something to tide you over when you're in that anxious mood, but you still want to read horror, because if you're like me, no matter how anxious you are, you want to keep reading horror, even if it's stressing you out even more. So these are kind of safe ones to pick up. So that is it for this video. I would love to know, of the books I talked about, are there any that you're planning on checking out for yourself? And I would also love to hear your comfort read. So if you have a horror comfort read, let me know that. Or if you go to other genres, let me know what genre or what particular book you go back to when you're just feeling stressed and need something really comforting to read. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror, thrillers, science fiction, and fantasy. You can help me out by sharing this video around online, giving it a thumbs up, dropping a comment, even if it's just a little emoji like a ghost or a vampire. And if you want to help me out more, you can hit that little notification bell so that you never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.